You better listen to me right now.
I think you should walk away.
The neon sign of the last call diner buzzed with a low, relentless hum that seemed to match the bone-deep exhaustion settled in Clara's soul. It was midnight on a bleak late October night, the kind of damp, miserable weather where the cold creeps straight through the brick wall and settles deep inside your joints. Clara wiped down the worn laminate counter for what felt like the 100th time, her motions mechanical, her mind floating away to a small, two-bedroom apartment 3 miles down the highway. In that small room, her 7-year-old son, Toby, was fast asleep under a fading cartoon blanket, supervised by her older sister, Sarah. Working the graveyard shift at a road-stop diner wasn't the life Clara had envisioned when she was younger, but life had a cruel way of stripping away dreams until only survival was left. It paid the modest rent, put groceries in the fridge, and gave her a sense of fragile, honest independence after years of running from a past that felt like a phantom constantly walking 3 steps behind her. The diner was almost entirely empty. The air smelled of burnt espresso, stale fryer oil, and the faint tang of bleach. In the far corner booth, a long-haul trucker sat hunched over a cold mug of black coffee, his eyelids heavy, his breathing steady and slow as he fought off sleep before his next 200-mile leg. Beyond the fogged glass of the front windows, the 2-lane highway stretched out into complete darkness, surrounded by dense pines that swayed rhythmically under the rising wind. Clara pulled a clean rag from beneath the sink, her body aching, her thoughts burdened by the unpaid utility bill resting in her canvas purse. She tried to tell herself that tomorrow would be easier, but deep down, she knew that tomorrow would look exactly like today. That was until the heavy glass door clattered open, breaking the silence with a harsh metallic clang that vibrated through the small building. A bitter gust of rain-slicked wind swept into the warm interior, bringing with it a man whose very presence shifted the oxygen in the room. He walked in with an erratic, volatile energy, his heavy boots dragging slightly, his leather jacket dripping wet from the steady drizzle outside. His eyes were small, dark, and restless, darting around the empty vinyl booths before locking directly onto Clara. Clara felt a cold, familiar knot tighten at the base of her stomach. She recognized that look immediately. It was the distinct, unmistakable posture of a man carrying a reservoir of unaddressed rage, looking for any excuse to spill it onto someone weaker than himself. He didn't take a booth. Instead, he marched straight toward the counter, swinging his leg over a swivel stool right in front of the cash register. He slammed his thick, calloused palms onto the formica surface with a loud, echoey thud that made the salt shakers rattle. His name was Marcus, though Clara didn't know it yet. To her, he was just another dangerous variable in a world full of unpredictable men. Clara took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing her shoulders to drop, masking her anxiety behind a professional, neutral expression. She had learned long ago that with men like this, showing fear was like pouring gasoline on a flickering flame. She approached the counter, kept her voice calm, and asked him what he would like to order, praying he just wanted. Marcus didn't glance at the plastic menu resting between the napkin dispenser and the ketchup bottle. He stared straight into Clara's face, his gaze lingering on the faded scar near her collarbone, his mouth twisting into a mocking, predatory smirk. He ordered a black coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs with bacon, but his tone carried no warmth or basic courtesy. It sounded like a military command issued to a subordinate. Clara gave a single, firm nod, turned her back to him, and walked toward the kitchen pass-through window to place the order ticket. Every nerve ending in her back tingled with tension. She could feel his eyes burning into her spine, tracking her every movement with a dark, deliberate weight. While the kitchen cook, an elderly man named Artie who was half-deaf and slow on his feet, dropped the bacon onto the sizzling flat-top grill, Clara walked over to the coffee maker to pour Marcus his drink. As the dark liquid filled the ceramic mug, Marcus began to speak. His voice was low, rasping, and deliberately laced with cruel undertones that barely carried over the hum of the refrigerator. He didn't just want food, he was actively looking to dismantle someone's dignity. He began criticizing everything about the environment, the faint dirt on the windowpane, the flickering neon light outside, the smell of the grease, and finally, the speed of her service. Clara kept her mouth shut, focusing entirely on keeping her hands steady as she lifted the heavy glass pot. She walked back to his stool and carefully set the coffee mug down in front of him. But her hands, trembling slightly from the sheer force of her suppressed anxiety, betrayed her. As the bottom of the mug touched the saucer, a single droplet of hot black coffee sloshed over the rim, pooling into the white porcelain base. It was a minor, imperceptible mistake that any ordinary customer would have ignored or brushed off with a paper napkin. But to Marcus, who was actively searching for a spark to ignite his internal furnace, it was the exact pretext he was waiting for. His eyes widened, his jaw set, and the air around the counter instantly turned ice cold. Before Clara could even open her mouth to utter a quiet, automatic apology, Marcus reacted with terrifying, explosive speed. He didn't yell, he didn't throw a verbal insult. He simply lunged across the narrow counter, his thick right hand sweeping forward in a brutal, arc-like motion. The back of his heavy hand slammed into the left side of Clara's face with a violent, sickening crack that echoed off the stainless steel appliances. The sheer force of the blow snapped her head sideways, throwing her off balance and knocking her violently back into the metal prep table behind her. A tray of clean glass water tumblers shattered against the floor, showering the linoleum with bright, glittering shards. Clara slid down against the edge of the counter, her vision swimming with bright white flashes, her left ear ringing violently. She pressed her hand against her throbbing cheek, feeling the immediate, burning rise of skin and blood where his knuckles had torn her lip. In the back booth, the long-haul trucker jolted upright, his eyes wide with shock, but before he could process what had happened or even stand up from his seat, a sound roared from the highway outside, a deep, gut-rattling rumble that shook the frame of the diner itself. It wasn't the sound of an oncoming freight truck, it was the synchronized, thunderous growl of heavy V-twin engines idling down from high speed. The roar grew deafening as four massive motorcycles pulled directly onto the gravel lot, their headlights cutting through the foggy windows in bright, blinding beams of white light. The engines cut off simultaneously, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence that felt heavier than the noise that preceded it. Seconds later, the diner's heavy front door was pushed open with slow, terrifying deliberate force, colliding with the brass bell above in a clear, lingering chime. Through the doorway walked four men clad in heavy, road-worn leather vests, their steel-toed boots striking the linoleum floor in rhythmic, unhurried unison. The silver and red embroidered patches stitched across the backs and breasts of their leather jackets shimmered under the flickering lights, bearing the iconic, feared crest of the Hells Angels. They didn't rush inside shouting or drawing weapons, they entered with the terrifying, absolute calmness of men who fully understood that power is not demonstrated by noise, but by presence. The leader of the group was a massive, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a thick, steel-gray beard that fell down his chest, a weather-beaten face lined with old scars, and eyes as cold and sharp as polished flint. He took 2 steps into the room, his gaze sweeping the space, before stopping dead in his tracks as his eyes fell upon Clara sitting bruised on the floor, holding her bleeding face amidst shattered glass. The silence in the diner was absolute. The air became so thick it felt almost impossible to draw a full breath. Marcus turned slowly on his stool, his chest swelling instinctively as he tried to project an aura of toughness, trying to mask the sudden spike of adrenaline threatening to paralyze him. He opened his mouth, clearly intending to throw out a threat or tell them to mind their own business, but the gray-bearded rider didn't even acknowledge his existence. The leader simply raised one large, gloved hand, holding it in the air for a fraction of a second. That simple gesture carried so much silent, terrifying authority that Marcus's words caught squarely in his throat, dying before they could reach his lips. The 4 bikers didn't look at Marcus with explosive anger, they looked at him with an icy, clinical detachment, the way an exterminator looks at a pest that has crawled onto a clean table. The lead rider stepped right past Marcus's stool, treating him as though he were an inanimate piece of furniture, and walked around the wooden divider to approach the counter where Clara was struggling to lift herself up. His entire demeanor underwent a radical, unexpected transformation. The intimidating, ruthless aura melted away, replaced by an extraordinary, soft tenderness. He knelt down on one knee right in front of the broken glass, ignoring the sharp edges pressing into his thick denim jeans. His deep, gravelly voice was surprisingly quiet as he asked her if she was all right, reaching out with a massive, leather-gloved hand to gently brush a strand of hair away from her face, taking extreme care not to touch her swelling cheek. Clara could barely draw breath, her body trembling violently from the lingering shock of the assault and the overwhelming physical presence of the four men now occupying the room. She managed a faint, terrified nod. It was then that the gray-bearded man reached into the interior pocket of his heavy leather vest, pulled out an old, worn leather wallet and extracted a small, laminated photograph that was noticeably faded around the edges. Without saying a word, he slid the picture across the stainless steel counter, placing it directly in front of her eyes. Clara looked down at the small piece of paper, and her breath caught violently in her throat, her heart skipping a beat before slamming against her ribs. The photograph was over 20 years old. It showed a young, smiling woman standing right in front of this very same diner, holding the tiny hand of a little 4-year-old girl with bright blue eyes and dark curly hair, a girl who was unmistakably Clara. And standing right behind the woman in the photograph, with a protective arm wrapped around her shoulders, was the gray-bearded man himself, 20 years younger, his face free of scars, wearing the very same leather vest he wore tonight. Clara lifted her gaze from the faded photograph to the heavily lined face of the man kneeling before her. The realization hit her with a physical force that surpassed the strike she had taken moments earlier. This man was not a random traveler who had happened to pull into a late-night diner by coincidence. His name was Thomas. He was her mother's older brother, the uncle who had vanished into the dusty horizon decades ago after a devastating family dispute had shattered their home, leaving Clara and her mother to navigate a harsh world entirely on their own. Marcus, completely blind to the emotional weight unfolding between the two people at the counter, misread the quiet intensity of the moment as an opportunity to regain control of the room. The embarrassment of being ignored by four men had curdled back into foolish, desperate arrogance. He shoved his heavy wooden stool backward, the metal legs screeching loudly against the floor, and stood up to his full height. He shouted at the bikers, demanding to know who they thought they were, warning them in a high-pitched, strained voice that he knew people in this town and that they had better back off before things got ugly. The three other bikers didn't even flinch at his outburst. One of them, a towering, heavily tattooed man with a braided beard who went by the name of Bear, turned slowly toward Marcus. Without speaking a single word, Bear took 2 long steps forward, positioning his massive, solid frame directly between Marcus and the front door, effectively blocking the only exit in the building. The second rider stepped to the left, closing off the aisle leading toward the back restrooms, while the third posted himself near the kitchen door. They moved with absolute, tactical efficiency, turning the open diner into an inescapable trap within a matter of seconds. Thomas did not turn around immediately. He kept his soft, steady gaze fixed on Clara's face, reaching out with his bare, calloused hand to cover her trembling fingers. He gave her hand a firm, reassuring squeeze, a gesture that seemed to carry 20 years of unsaid apologies, buried grief, and an implicit, absolute vow of protection. Then, with agonizing slowness, Thomas stood up to his full height, turned on his heel, and faced Marcus. He didn't raise his hands into a fighting stance. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply walked straight up to Marcus until his wide chest was inches away from the smaller man's face, staring down at him with eyes that promised cold, absolute retribution. Thomas spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a razor blade. He told Marcus that the life he had lived up until 5 minutes ago was officially over, and that every breath he took from this second forward depended entirely on how he conducted himself in this room. The shift in Marcus's face was immediate and absolute. The false bravery drained out of him in an instant, leaving behind a pale, sweat-sheened mask of pure, unadulterated terror as the gravity of his mistake finally crushed his ego. He realized, with terrifying clarity, that he was not dealing with an ordinary tavern brawler, he was standing in front of men who operated by a ruthless code of loyalty and honor. Bear stepped up from behind, grabbing Marcus by his collar with a grip like an iron vice, forcing him down onto his knees right on the dirty linoleum floor. The man who had entered the diner 30 minutes ago looking for someone to abuse was now reduced to a trembling, weeping wreck, his knees knocking together, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he stared at the floorboards. Thomas didn't allow him to look away. He commanded Marcus to lift his head and look directly into Clara's eyes, to see the human being he had dared to strike, to feel the full weight of the cowardice he had displayed. Marcus's voice broke into high-pitched, pathetic sobs as he sputtered out an apology, his words disjointed, his arrogance completely shattered into dust. But Thomas wasn't interested in empty words spoken out of fear. He turned back toward Clara, his face softening once more as he addressed his niece. He told her that for 20 long years, he had lived with the crushing guilt of leaving his sister and her child behind, that he had spent the last 5 years searching every highway, small town, and diner along this stretch of state road trying to track her down after learning of her mother's passing. He explained that finding her tonight was not a twist of fate, but the fulfillment of a solemn promise he had made on his sister's memory to ensure Clara would never have to defend herself alone ever again. The 4 men did not commit a senseless act of violence in that diner. Instead, they delivered a systematic, overwhelming lesson in justice. Bear and the other 2 riders lifted Marcus off his knees, hauling him out the front door into the freezing rain where they ensured he was met by the local county sheriff, a man who owed Thomas a debt from a lifelong past, along with enough documented evidence and explicit warnings to guarantee Marcus would face full legal prosecution and never set foot anywhere near that county again. When Thomas walked back inside the diner half an hour later, the rain outside had begun to lighten into a soft, harmless mist. The dark sky over the distant mountain ridge was starting to break, displaying the very first pale slivers of amber and gold light as dawn approached. The elderly cook, Artie, brought out a clean dustpan and swept away the broken glass, leaving the floor immaculate once again. Thomas walked over to the counter, taking off his heavy leather gloves, and sat down on the stool where Marcus had been sitting hours before. He wasn't acting as a feared figure of the open road, he was just an aging, tired uncle who had finally reached the end of a long, painful journey home. Clara stood behind the counter, her cheek still tender and bruised, but the cold, constant knot of fear that had lived in her chest for years was completely gone. She picked up a fresh ceramic mug, walked over to the steaming coffee pot, and poured him a hot cup, her hands completely steady this time. As she set the mug down on the saucer in front of him, Thomas reached out and touched her hand once more, smiling softly through his gray beard. They didn't need to fill the room with endless explanations or dwell on the years they had lost. The silence between them was no longer dark or heavy, it was filled with the quiet, unshakable warmth of family, bound by a promise that time and distance could never truly erase. True protection doesn't come from the violence we inflict on the world, but from the lengths we are willing to go to shield the people we love from ever feeling alone in the dark again.